We are dealing with a multifaceted phenomenon, and Gordon Crichton was unique in his knowledge both of intelligence matters, geography. Gordon Crichton was also exceptionally knowledgeable on metaphysical matters. So he passed away last year, leaving Flying Saucer Review still going. However, another magazine is UFO magazine, which is, I think, the only magazine ever to have been available in many countries around the world on the newsstands, and it was available on newsstands until a month or so ago. The March issue was the last, very sadly. It's gone into voluntary liquidation, but mostly the reason is because Graham Birdsall, who was editor since its inception, together with his brother Mark, but then by himself, was an outstanding character in the field of, as a master of ceremonies at UFO conferences. He organized in the United Kingdom, and he was an excellent editor. And he sadly died tragically at the age of 49. He had a brain hemorrhage, and sometime later, sadly, he died due to complications. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this face. It's the late, great Dr. John Altshuler, who died this year at the end of January. He's one of the great unsung heroes of the UFO field, particularly in the field of animal mutilations. He was a dear friend and an excellent scientist, and he was the first, actually, to investigate the animal mutilations from a professional point of view. He's a hematologist. He was a professional, obviously, hematologist, and he was the first to cut up bits of a mutilated animal. And this is Lady from Alamosa in 1967, often mistakenly referred to as Snippy. John Altshuler had thousands of slides. I don't mean these kind of slides. I mean, you know, tissue samples put between glass. Thousands of them, which we looked at together. He showed me through his microscope. And this is ordinary tissue control sample. And this is an example of tissue from mutilated hide of a cow. The hemoglobin has been cooked by extreme heat. When John would show me these slides, he'd always say, "Timothy, only heat can do this." John was also an accomplished pilot, and I went flying with him in Colorado. We flew from Littleton and we flew to Alamosa for the first time. He went back since those days of 1967. He was very nervous about going back because he'd had some very unnerving experiences with the UFO phenomenon while he was investigating that case. And while we were flying into Alamosa, after going over the great National Sand Dunes Monument, a strange thing happened. We were unable to make radio contact with both radios to the airport at Alamosa. So, unfortunately, we just had to go straight in, which is, of course, forbidden by FAA rules. We landed. Another plane happened to be in the circuit right behind us, came in, and we got an irate bollocking, as we'd say in the United Kingdom, from some guy who said, you know, for God's sakes, why didn't you let us know we were there, where you were? And we said we couldn't contact. We couldn't get in touch with the tower at all. Another experience happened to John Altshuler many years ago in the 1980s. He was going from Denver to northern New Mexico to give a lecture on hematology at one of the universities. And he landed in New Mexico, and the guys at the airport said, "Where the hell have you been? We've put out the first phase of a search and rescue. You're 40 minutes late." John said, "What are you talking about? There's nothing wrong. I've not gone flying anywhere else." and they said, we're going to charge you. This is a FAA regulation that we must fine you about. So he said, well, I tell you what, have a look at the fuel tank and compare the engine hours, and sure enough, he hadn't been doing any extra flying. The distance covered was absolutely right for the engine time and the amount of fuel in the tank. So something happened during that 40 minutes. He hadn't the slightest notion of what it could be, no sense of missing time, which there obviously was, but no sense of anything awry at all. I should just say that you know, John was one of the great unsung heroes, and his death, the conspiracy theorists might have a field day, but he was run down in June of 2001 or 2002, I think, and he became actually quadriplegic at one point. He was run down exercising on his bicycle, and he made a tremendous recovery. He came over to London with his wife Barbara. He was great. But then suddenly this year in January, some basic operation complications arising from his injuries, and he passed away. Can you see the slides okay? Are they a bit dark? Okay? Yeah, we will need to see the slides. We really do. Then the problem is, of course, for the video cams that yeah, okay. Well, I'll keep going. Just a few events in the United Kingdom recently. This last year there was a great British UFO hoax. What some guys did, they spent £35,000, that's about $55,000 I guess, making a flying saucer which was about 25 feet in diameter. They spent a lot of time on it as well as money. They inserted motors, little fan motors, and they flew it, radio controlled, right over Avebury, which is the centre of sort of crop circle activity in the United Kingdom in Wiltshire, and to show, you know, how easily people could be fooled. Well, sure enough, people reported seeing a flying saucer, and they gave a very accurate description of it. So in one sense, the hoax backfired. People were reporting accurately what they saw. Fortunately, other people saw the thing landing and being greeted by the team of manufacturers not far away in a field. Can you see that clearly? Look on the horizon. It's the best UFO picture you'll see. Well, this is an evening picture of Plymouth in the southwest of England, and tremendous fuss was made about this in all the local papers in that part of the world. They said that this was a genuine UFO sighting. The experts were all agreed. It's actually a lens flare, and you can make them yourself. It's just a reflection of a lens element, or sometimes several lens elements in the camera. And you get that when you're taking photographs against bright light sources, even at an angle. Not long afterwards, Britain's Daily Mail announced that UFO sightings were on the decrease worldwide, but, you know, there may be something out there. Nick Pope, in his workshop this afternoon, was talking about the flying triangles seen over twin Air Force bases in the United Kingdom in 1993, which he investigated in his capacity as UFO desk officer at the Ministry of Defence. Don't get too excited. It's not a genuine photograph. It's a nice digital fabrication done for the newspapers. This was in Chester, in a suburb of Chester, in late February, February 29 this year. Chester in the UK, in the north east of England. Quite a number of witnesses came forward, including a retired pilot and somebody working at British Aerospace in Wharton, which isn't all that far away, which of course leads to the question, you know, could this have been some kind of experimental aircraft? Well, it could, but as Nick and I have pointed out countless times, you don't test top secret aircraft above crowded council house estates where they can be seen by thousands of people. Perhaps an accident might occur. There are proscribed areas where you test fly aircraft, both in your country and in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Sharon Larkin is a sort of leading light up in the Cumbria area of Great Britain, and she found this extraordinary artifact which excited her greatly, and she wondered what it was. Big article in the newspapers. I had a long think about this, and I decided it's actually a present from the Nordics to the Nordics. In fact, it turned out to be a magnetoid. Have anybody heard of that? It's an American device, part of two, I think, for massaging the back, I believe. European Union, it was in late January, questions were raised by a committee saying that it was time for the European Union and the European Parliament to take the UFO questions seriously. And Nick and I gave an interview for this paper, The European Voice, which came out nearly a month ago. We both independently decided, when asked by the newspaper journalist what would happen, we both said it will come to nothing, because there was a previous attempt by an Italian member of the European Parliament to create a committee to study the UFO phenomenon, but owing to ridicule in the media, it was completely dropped. So they had to wait 11 years before trying again, and I'm afraid I think the same will happen. Now, I mentioned yesterday Sir Peter Horsley, Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley. He was a decorated war hero. He was Deputy Chief of Strike Command with his finger on the nuclear trigger. He'd flown 90 different types of aircraft, types or marks of aircraft, and he was also involved at the Ministry of Defense at one time in the operations room, studying some of the many UFO reports that came in at that time. And in 1954, while working for the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen at Buckingham Palace as their military equerry or attaché, where he worked for 7 years, he had a 2-hour meeting with an apparently extraterrestrial human being in the centre of London, arranged for him by a British Army general. He published that story in his autobiography, Sounds from Another Room, and he gave me a little bit more information and kindly gave me permission to include this information in my book, Alien Base. Now, in 1997, this is when I last spoke to him in person, he told me that one of the things that bothered him about this encounter was that this alien could read his mind. Secondly, the alleged alien, I should say, knew all Britain's top secret nuclear secrets. This terrified Sir Peter. Well, eventually the meeting drew to a close, and he went back to Buckingham Palace and he reported it to, first of all, Prince Philip's secretary, and he discussed it with the Duke of Edinburgh. Yes? An extraterrestrial human being means someone who looks like a human being who comes from extraterrestrial, meaning off this earth. To all intents and purposes, this guy didn't say I'm from another planet, but he behaved as if he were one. The information that he gave was indicating as much. He told Sir Peter that there were many vehicles coming here from elsewhere, that most of the ones we see are remotely controlled probes, but that there had been many landings and so forth. Some of these beings, he said, had infiltrated in great secrecy. They were able to take good care of themselves thanks to their extraordinary extrasensory powers, particularly their telepathic abilities, and he said their ability to access other dimensions. He said that the universe consisted of countless galaxies in which life had evolved. All the building blocks of matter were such that human beings, for example, even had developed in other parts of the galaxy. He implied perhaps that there had been colonization as well. Sir Peter had become interested in the subject of UFOs, though he was very skeptical at first, and he had discussed it with the Duke of Edinburgh, who was very interested, and the Duke had asked him to find out what he could about the subject. So what happened was a lady contacted a general in the British Army whom she knew and said, I think, Sir Peter, there's someone I know who Sir Peter might like to meet, and I strongly advise him to do so. It might answer a lot of the questions he has. And that's how it came about. Sorry, the gentleman, would you like to repeat that? Just turn around. Okay, yes, the gentleman asked, that if he was an extraterrestrial human being, it implied that other human beings had developed independently of the human race. That's not necessarily the case. I don't know where human beings originated, but it was implied there were other human-type beings elsewhere in the cosmos. It can certainly affect the individual mind and thought processes, because these guys not only are able to read our thoughts, they can put thoughts and feelings into our head. It's been on many occasions when people are afraid, suddenly they're overcome with a feeling of great peace in encounters with extraterrestrials. So they're clearly able to influence people's minds. As to souls, why not? I think the next day Sir Peter went back to this place. It was in Chelsea, not quite central London, but it was a Mrs. Markham, but it was a pseudonym, unfortunately. And he had trouble getting any confirmation from the British Army General, who wasn't present at the meeting. The Mrs. Markham was at the meeting, but the British Army General was not, and he became uncooperative, I believe, following that encounter as to confirmation and so forth, especially since he wasn't there. All he said was that we are able to take care of ourselves not only by our telepathic abilities, but our ability to use, I think was the verb, to use other dimensions. I would assume use means access. Nothing more than that, I'm afraid. The description he gave me was a guy, maybe 40s, late 40s, something like that, dressed in a suit, looking quite ordinary in most respects. Quite commonplace in many respects. No really detailed descriptions of anything else. Well, as I say, that encounter was reported in some depth in Sir Peter's extraordinary book, Sounds from Another Room, his autobiography, and we have to give credit to him because, he's one of the few guys, high-ranking, military, attached to the royal family and so forth, who had the guts to come forward. And one wonders just how many more people in high places have had contact with ETs. I mentioned briefly yesterday Rubens Vilela, a Brazilian meteorologist. In 1952, in the late on through the 50s, he served as a communications specialist with the CIA in Washington. And later, as a meteorologist, he was invited to go on several expeditions to the Antarctic, mostly with the United States Navy, some with the Brazilian Navy. And in 1961, he had an extraordinary sighting from a US Navy icebreaker, which was witnessed by many of those on board. Later, he apparently established communications with ETs. And some of the information, I think, is very interesting indeed. He learnt through an intermediary that there was more than one species coming here, and that there was enmity between these two groups, that we were like as if in the middle of a struggle of some kind. Villela also observed, he never met actual aliens in person, but he observed the craft, and they were able, he wanted proof, and through some guy who was, I suppose, in some kind of trance, there was a medium there apparently, he was able to ask questions and he was able to get proof of their abilities when he asked them to demonstrate something that would convince him. And they actually controlled the local weather very dramatically and visible for him and other witnesses to see. He also learnt that there was actually a base in Antarctica. They apparently are self-adapting beings, he learnt, who could survive in any part of our world. They required our water as a source of energy in a form still unknown to us. They even suggested it might be a good idea to establish open contact under controlled conditions in Antarctica with some of our nations on Earth, but obviously, or maybe not, the idea was dropped. Later on, Villela witnessed a lot of activity in a certain part of Brazil where it was apparent that the aliens were trying to construct a base of some type on a farm property, and he was involved in that. He said that today I accept the UFO phenomenon as factual. The existence of life in the universe is not a belief many of my colleagues share. Remember, this man is a respected scientist. As we approach the new millennium, astronomers and journalists will probably feel very frustrated. The astronomers for ignoring the existence of other life forms, the journalists for having missed the greatest news story of the century. Any questions about Villela?
What was the nature of his involvement with the construction of this base?
As I recall, I can't remember everything word for word in my books, but it is in detail in Unearthly Disclosure. I think through this intermediary, stroke medium or whatever, he was asked to obtain permission from the farmer on where they plan to drill to produce this base. They have apparently phenomenal boring abilities, which I will go into. It was a subterranean base, yes, on a ranch in a specific area in Brazil, and I can't remember the specific area. So he did indeed obtain permission from the rancher or farmer, and they saw many of these craft coming and going in this particular area. Villela is still very much alive. He is a professor at the University of Sao Paulo, and I believe he runs, or he's a sort of anchor at the Weather Channel. Well, he was until fairly recently. I don't know if he's retired now. The Weather Channel in Sao Paulo.
Why do they need a base?
Very good question. I don't know. My understanding is that they have a number of bases around the world, which I'll be going into in great detail towards the end of this presentation, information that came to me via, not directly, via a very high-ranking Pentagon source. Apparently, they do indeed have bases.
Do the bases predate us?
It's a very good question. Do the bases predate us? My feeling is that some of the bases might be very, very old indeed. There might be a link here with former civilizations on this planet, some of whom themselves might have very highly advanced space travel vehicles. That's just a thought I have. I don't know that that's the case. But in any event, they have bases, either recently manufactured, or some of them apparently were recently, relatively recently, post-World War II. Others may go back thousands of years. I don't know.
There's no sense of why?
No sense of why? Not really. As you'll hear later, I might go into some detail. The strange thing I learned, it might be disinformation from this Pentagon, via this Pentagon source, was that some of the bases, certainly in the continental United States, are guarded by US Army personnel. And there's a very interesting case back from 1947 at Fort Hood, which was, of course, an Army camp, when a number of people there were guarding, they didn't know what, in an area, and one night they were astonished to see UFOs exiting or landing at an area within this camp. And that report came to John Timmerman and was published in the International UFO Reporter. I honestly don't know the reasons. Why would anyone need a base with such advanced technology? I don't know. In Puerto Rico, one of the people I interviewed who claimed to have been abducted and taken to an alien base, they told him, well, you know, we've got lots of craft here. They showed him all different types of craft, you name it, boomerang shaped, cigar shaped, circular craft of all different shapes and sizes, and they said, we need this craft to maintain, that we need this base to maintain our craft. I'm not saying that's true, I don't know. But I think it's interesting that Villela was told that they did indeed, at this time, this was in the 1970s, because he'd seen a craft in 1961 in Antarctica, it got him thinking, and they said that they had a base in Antarctica. Now I'm going to relate details of an extraordinary contact story by a guy called Enrique Castillo Rincon. He claims to have had extensive contacts with ETs back in the 1970s, beginning in 1973. It's an outstanding story. By all accounts, and from all people who've met this guy, he's an extremely sincere man. He's suffered a great deal of ridicule, and the last I heard about him, about 3 or 4 years ago, he was knocked down, apparently deliberately. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but this, according to witnesses, was actually apparently deliberate. He was knocked down. It didn't kill him, but he was badly injured. And only a few days later, he was due to give a presentation at some symposium elsewhere in South America, I believe. The first encounter happened with 2 other colleagues. He was working for the Costa Rica Electrical Board. And this was in June 1963. They were preparing for the visit of President John Kennedy, and they needed to establish a communications link around the island. And at the time, there were lots of earth tremors. The volcano was getting annoyed a bit. And as these guys, Enrique and the others, were setting up this stuff, they saw 2 discs approach them. They were very large, about 45 meters in diameter, they guessed, and about 12 meters high. One of them came down to within a few meters of the edge of the crater, then the other one stayed at a distance. They found their willpower numbed, and they became immobilized. Seconds later, they suffered a dreadful itch, as if thousands of ants had attacked them. There was a high-pitched whistle. Some device came out of the craft, they don't know what. And as they stood there, immobilized, the craft tilted and shot off, followed by the second one. They suffered dizziness, vomiting, and stomach cramps, having to relieve themselves on the way back, and they made for the hospital. I think the hospital staff thought that, you know, gave them a glass of milk each and told them to be on their way. Some weeks later, strange events started in Enrique's house. There were violent shakings, almost poltergeist-type activity, strange noises. He had dreadful buzzing in his head. And this went on for quite some time, and of course other members of his family noticed it as well. Years went by. Then he went to Caracas, Venezuela, where he befriended a very unusual man. He said he was a Swiss national. He looked about 27 years old, very handsome, very calm, collected. And he said he was working for a wholesale distributing company. Well, they made good friends. There's a lot of information about what happened during this encounter with the Swiss businessman in the book. Then years went by. 1973 came. Enrique went to Bogota, Colombia. And to cut a long story short, he succeeded in establishing communications with ET, who asked him to come to a certain area, some distance from a lake. It was a lake which he has never named, some distance from Bogota. Well, two craft came out of the lake, and there's the main one there. There were dripping water, and two beings were beamed down, and they had already prepared Enrique by giving him a small sphere which they said would energize when their craft were near, and then he would approach them, and they took him on board. He was beamed on board the craft. Before entering the craft, there was a decontamination process. There were several humanoid beings on board, one of whom, it turned out, was the Swiss businessman. Contact was by both verbal and telepathic communications. They claimed to come from the ever-popular Pleiades region, which they said was 500 light years away from us, not 400. They said they came from a solar system of 3 suns. That sounds outrageous, but in fact, solar systems comprising 2 and 3 suns are relatively common throughout the universe. When people say, you know, oh, we come from the Pleiades, one needs to be a bit specific. The Pleiades is actually 30 light years across. Okay? And most astronomers would certainly be very suspicious, because it's only roughly 50 million years old, which they say is much too young for life to have evolved. However, with advanced technology, colonization, why not? When did you leave your planet? Asked Enrique. Oh, we just left it, they said. Of course, this was completely bemusing for Enrique. He couldn't grasp it. They showed him around the craft, including the propulsion center, which included a mental means of controlling the craft. It was a mind-machine integration process. Sounds mad? Well, I don't know about, I'm sure in the United States, certainly in the UK, we've been developing what's called cockpit cognitive system for pilots of the future, and they're already looking into this technology ourselves, so it's not such a mad idea. They predicted some rather depressing events for us. For starters, a third world war. They said that there would be many problems on our planet. They said that, for example, there was going to be problems with the sun, the corona of the sun. There would be certain changes in that which would affect things on this planet. There would be a lot of geological changes, climate changes, and so forth. And they were monitoring all these possibilities. Well, Enrique had several other contacts. The second one, he saw the same beings, but there were other species present, he claims. He was also taken to a mothership through a hatch. Again, much warnings about dire events on Earth. Pay attention to the environmental changes, they said, and the ozone layers. The weakness of your leaders and their lack of credibility. Loss of religious values. Growth of crime and the lack of countermeasures against it. No government on Earth, they said, will be able to win the battle against crime and insecurity. We cannot intervene directly, but we can subtly implant ideas in some people's minds of those placed in certain positions. So there's a glimmer of hope there. Enrique said, hey guys, why don't you just appear more openly in front of people to prove your existence? And they said, okay, come with us. So they took him on board one of the smaller craft, which they launched from the motherships, and they took him to an area in South America, not far from it was in Colombia, I believe. And they circled around until they found a farm. It was early in the morning, and there were these farmers milking a cow, and they went right down and sort of appeared at a very low level. Well, there was pandemonium. The cow kicked the bucket, not quite literally, but knocking the milk over. The farmers ran in all directions, screaming. And Enrique said, yeah, but these are peasants, you know. I mean, sophisticated people would have no problems with a close encounter like this. And they said, hang on, let's find someone else. So they buzzed down a highway. It was still a relatively remote area, buzzed down a highway until they found some suits, you know, some guys in a business suit driving down the highway in a car. And they said, let's see what happens here. So they actually lowered the craft and hovered right beside the car for a while, and then shot up in the front and went to see what would happen. Well, of course, the car braked and swerved violently. The men in business suits jumped out of the car before it had even stopped, while the guy was still braking. One of them injured himself, apparently, and tore his nice suit on the barbed wire of a fence beside the road. So they said, does that answer your question? Then Enrique was taken somewhere else, to Africa, in a very short space of time. They took him down for a queue of sad people, desperate, poverty-stricken people queuing up for a Red Cross supply of milk and nutriments and so forth. And they invited him to study this situation. The spiritual and political leaders, not only of Africa, but of the whole world, take advantage of this situation, they said. We do not contact those we don't trust. Well, on board the craft, there were several other meetings. At one stage, some gorgeous women entered, and Enrique was horrified because the men didn't stand up, you know, and he said, what kind of gentlemen were these? But I think they're fairly more advanced now on the other planets regarding sexual equality. The Central Intelligence Agency, in my opinion, although an agency's name was never given, invited all expenses paid trip to Washington to interrogate Enrique. And he informed his wife, of course. He had to sign various papers saying that he agreed to various tests, sodium pentothal, hypnotic, and so forth, things like that to be taken. And he was escorted from Bogota to Washington, and then driven in a car with not exactly blacked out windows, but he was driven to what I would assume would be what is known as a safe house. It was a journey of some distance, but not long. And on arrival, he was greeted by a nurse and doctors. They showed him to his room. There was a library, including at least one book on UFOs, would you believe? This sounds absolutely wild, but they were always, at all times, polite to him. And then began the series of tests which covered several days. The first was a polygraph test. And then there was a US Air Force doctor who initiated hypnotic regression to try and get as much information about his contacts, what he had learnt, as possible. This was the idea. Also, sodium pentothal, the so-called truth drug, was used to try and extract information. He was questioned at great length. And after several days there, he was escorted to the airport, and he flew home. They gave him £1,000 cash for his trouble. They said that his belongings were all returned to him. They said that the results of the test would be sent to the American embassy in Bogota, but he's still waiting for those results. some stage, this is a very long, convoluted story. At some stage, Enrique was taken by craft to what they said was a sort of center in the Peruvian Andes, a type of base, but there were at least 300 terrestrial people there who were being instructed by the aliens to go to from different countries. These people staying at the base, some complete families apparently, were there receiving instructions and a type of indoctrination process, so that in the coming calamitous events, allegedly on planet Earth, these people would be able to deal in some ways with the situation. Maybe actors, teachers, I don't know. I have no idea.
How long ago did this talk?
This was 1973 was the first actual encounter with the ETs, and we're now in 1974 at the Peruvian Andes base.
When did he think these calamities were going to start?
I think, as far as I understand, I can remember from the good book here, the Book of Unearthly Disclosure, Book of Revelations, call it whatever you will. I think 2012 was mentioned. Now I remember, and I know that's cropped up before, and the New Age people will say, yeah, but it's Enrique, as far as I know, was one of the first to talk about it. There may be people who know more about that than me, but he was speaking about all this stuff. You think he might be tempted to add stuff, to interpolate, to add new material, you know, since the experience. But according to an Ecuador person, Bob Girard's wife, Monica, who knew Enrique Rincon, Castillo Rincon, he hasn't changed his story at all since the 1970s. Extraordinary experiences at this base, which are described in the book. And then he was taken from this base to a base in the Pacific Ocean, in the Marianas Trench, which is, you know, like some 11,000 meters depth. I don't know what that is in feet, but multiply it by 3 point something. I think it's the deepest part of the oceans on our planet. It's a shelf that digs down, and the base had been constructed conjointly with another race of extraterrestrials many years ago. It wasn't actually stated how long. And the base was built into the side of the actual trench. There's the Mariana or Marianas Trench, deepest part of our oceans. And here they received more instructions about coming calamities and so forth. And eventually he was returned. The contacts ended, as far as I know, in the late 1970s, but there are many, many other experiences he had, and I find it a compelling story, and I hope you do too. Any questions can I take about that now? He initially indeed was involved with a group who claimed to be able to get to communicate with these people, some mediums in South America. I forget whether it was Colombia or Venezuela at the time, but that is how the original contacts were apparently initiated, just as they were with the scientist Rubens Villela. But he had the proof, you know, the proof was, of course, when he actually saw these craft physically and met them physically and went on board the craft.
I've had several occultists tell me that they have encountered beings in pairs, hooded beings in pairs. Does that ring a bell at all?
In where?
Hooded beings in pairs.
In pairs? They weren't just in pairs. No, do you mean the contactees in pairs or the extraterrestrials in pairs? No, they weren't. Oh, I see. Groups. Yes, he did. As I said, you know, there were other races of beings on board this craft, and they shared that base in the Marianas with, well, apparently, if it was constructed conjointly with another race. And he did, on many occasions, see other type beings, and the details are in the book. I would like to give you all those details, but it's not just a sales ploy. Time is running out, and we need to go to another very important story, which begins in May of 1993. This is in Italy. Filiberto Caponi and his father. Caponi is an artisan and a very gifted painter who works in Pretari in Arquata del Tronto in the Abruzzi mountain regions of central Italy. I've been out to the area. I devote 6 chapters of my book to this case. Filiberto was coming home in May 1993, parking his car, when he heard this horrendous, high-pitched shrieking sound. And eventually he saw some kind of creature, and when he approached it, it appeared to be in a bundle, and you'll see the actual photographs very, very shortly. And he touched it with his foot. He thought it was some cat in a bandage, and it just leapt up into the air and shot off at very high speed, oscillating very, very swiftly from side to side. Phenomenal jumping ability, as you'll see from some of the sketches. Well, later in May, there was another event when he heard screams, and again he saw the creatures, and he took the first of these photographs of this creature, which you're going to see in a moment. First of all, that's how they appeared to him. This is a sketch of how this creature appeared to him initially. You see the bandages. It was wrapped up in bandages as though injured in some way. And that's when it jumped over the wall. That's his drawing of how it jumped. Extraordinary leaping abilities. This is the first photograph. He took the first Polaroid photograph from several meters away, but overnight the photographs, he took 2 photographs at this time, mysteriously transformed and sort of formed into a bas relief of some kind. I've seen them, I've handled them, and these are copies of the originals which I made in Rome. The actual blue section around there is not on the original. It's just an artifice produced by reflections when I copied the originals. And that's how it came out. He didn't know. The picture had sort of buckled in some way, as if something or someone was trying to damage the picture. And there's the other one. Parts of the Polaroid negative actually peeled off in this thing. So you might not find that very impressive, but as the months went by, there were further encounters. In June, for example, also there were sightings reported by a helicopter crew of an airborne creature bearing some similarity to this one. There was a retired Italian Air Force officer who encountered a creature on the ground, which again he went to touch, and again it leapt up into the air, and this time actually hovered in the air and flew off. A similar, but certainly not identical, but in some similarities to this creature. And this is when Filiberto took his first, this is an enlargement, by the way. You can see the bandages here. Maybe in the book you can see details clearly. A peculiar white substance here, which has been reported in 1 or 2 cases which Filiberto could not possibly have known about in Puerto Rico. He could not possibly have known about it because they weren't published. And then the months went by, and this was the first of his 3 close-up pictures. He got really close to the creature. It apparently let him photograph it with his Polaroid camera. It had these strange tubes coming out from the sternum area, again the white substance. And as usual, after each of these encounters, there was no communication. And ladies and gentlemen, we're not saying this is necessarily an extraterrestrial creature. Filiberto thought it was some experiment that had gone wrong up in the mountains, some secret laboratory or something. And it could be, except for its phenomenal abilities. There's another one. Filiberto just moved round again and took another picture. Get more idea of the structure of the head back here. And if you look very closely, you can see these sort of striations of color. Now again, bearing in mind Filiberto Caponi's profession as an artisan dealing in terracotta work and being a skilled painter, many people have assumed, oh yeah, well it's just a simple hoax. But I don't think a hoaxer would put bandages on an alien creature, and I think he would make it look more like E.T. from the films, because of course that was shown in Italy prior to all this. And then the last encounter in, I think, October of 1993. Here's the creature, again still with this white powder substance or whatever, and these tubes. In this case, it does look different. It was raining a lot at the time, so it appeared to be shiny, and eventually, of course, it ran off. But on that occasion, Filiberto said, I must get another witness. He ran upstairs in the house, got his grandmother to come down. His mother was terrified, hid beneath the sheets when all this was going on. So he got Grandma to come down, and she was nervous at first, but she came right up quite close to the creature as Filiberto took the picture and said, oh, what a sweet little chap, poor fellow. So she became, she found him quite endearing. And I found her very endearing too. A lovely lady, very warm, as many Italians are, of course, and very, very convincing witness. More of Filiberto's sketches of how the creature moved. It had almost sort of atrophied arms, you can see. The arms didn't seem to serve much function at all. Maybe it was an experiment gone wrong, but incredibly powerful legs. And here's some examples of Filiberto's paintings. Very skillful painter. He's done some murals in the house where he lives with his mother, and grandmother sadly passed away. But what I want to say is that when these photographs, they made news, there was a big news item. Filiberto went on television, on the second television channel in Rome, together with his grandmother and father, and of course the public went wild about all this. There was a lot of excitement, and at that time in Rome they were trying to get some serious journalists to pay attention to the story, and they were on their way back to their home in Rome when they noticed a car following them. They took note of the number plate. It was a Corps Diplomatique. It turned out to be, they took the number, it was an embassy car from the United States Embassy. This car followed them and chased them, and the family were convinced that American agents were trying to steal the photographs. Then another thing happened. Filiberto, the Carabinieri, that's the military police in Italy, turned up at his doorstep with a search and seizure warrant to confiscate the photographs. The photographs were confiscated. He was made to sign a document stating that he'd faked the photographs and the story. Well, he refused to sign the saying that he'd faked the story, but he did for the sake of his family and his reputation in the neighborhood and everything. He agreed that he'd fabricated the photographs, although he had not in fact done so, but the police, the Carabinieri, were very insistent that he had to do that. They confiscated the pictures. Then they got them back in 1998. I persuaded Filiberto to try, must get them back now, and with the help of a local politician and a lawyer, he did so, and they were returned in pristine condition. And as I say, the grandmother, I found a compelling witness. And one of his drawings, his paintings, of course, arouses suspicion that this was a terracotta model. But I commissioned some of his terracotta work. I commissioned Professor Roger Green, who is a forensic expert, does a lot of work for the police with imagery, video, films, photographs and such. And he did a very intensive analysis, several actually, of these photographs. And he said that it is not possible to determine the origination of such a creature from the images. Instinct suggests, however, that the complexity of the evidence reinforces the idea that it is a genuine creature which does not resemble a terracotta model made by Caponi. So, there we have it. We're not saying it's an alien. Nobody's saying it's an alien. We simply don't know what it is. But certainly it does bear a resemblance to some alien species, the typical greys that have been reported, as you know. We're going to go to Puerto Rico now. I've been there on 7 occasions. The last in 1998. And this is Captain Graham Shepherd, who will be known to some of you. He was a British Airways senior captain, flew jumbo jets and many others. This is a photograph I took of him in the cockpit of a Boeing 757. Now, in 1993, Graham was doing some research on the UFO situation in Puerto Rico, and he hired a Cessna 172. And here he is at the airport, I think in Mayaguez. He planned a trip to fly from San Juan along the coast. I'm going to show you in a minute. The flight plan proceeded here, north of the Arecibo radio telescope, to overfly and photograph the radio telescope site, and then proceed to Mayaguez. Well, what happened? This was fine. He photographed the telescope right here, and the next split second, with not the slightest sensation of any movement or even time passing in any way, he found himself here. It was very frightening for him at the time, and he, to a certain extent, threw the experience from his mind. After all, he had to get back to ground, and he found himself over a restricted area, and that's a Federal Aviation Administration irregularity. You don't fly over restricted sites. And this is the aerostat, the radar aerostat in Puerto Rico, which monitors drug smuggling and so forth. There's a conspiracy theorist rumor that it's actually a cover for an alien base. Let me tell you that Graham and I actually visited this base. The security is quite lax, and we spent 3 hours there, and we were allowed to go anywhere except the actual control room, just for security procedures, which is quite understandable. But and some of the radar frequencies were classified, but we were invited there, and it was a most enjoyable experience. But it was not enjoyable when Graham was flying over there in 1993 to find himself there in a restricted area. So he made way back, best way he knew, back to Mayaguez, and eventually landed, very shaken by the experience. And you can just see here the displacement. It was about 25 nautical miles he'd covered without, just like Dr. John Altshuler, not the slightest sensation of anything happening. There's the Arecibo site, which ironically, was one of the first places to be set up for SETI, communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course, it's still, I think, the world's largest radio telescope. About black helicopters, I've seen lots of these things in New Mexico. I've been to the Dulce area, by the way, and in Puerto Rico. People say, well, it didn't have any markings. It must be something very strange with this mystery helicopter. Yeah, there are genuine mystery helicopters, ladies and gentlemen, but there's nothing mysterious about them being unmarked. In fact, they're marked, but they're low-profile markings, and you do not see the markings unless you're up very close to some of these helicopters. This is a police officer that Graham, in 1998, I should say, before we go to that, I should say that in 1998, Graham and I flew the same plane twice. In 1997, I think, and 1988, we flew the same track twice. And of course, nothing unusual happened. And in 1998, we interviewed this guy, a police officer, the Puerto Rican police, who shot one of the mystery creatures that have plagued Puerto Rico, which has been plagued by unusual sightings of not just craft but strange beings, chupacabras type beings. And this policeman encountered a chupacabras about to kill his dog in the garage. He just saw it happening. This creature had a long tongue which was just about to insert into the dog. It was his pet, his chow dog. So what did he do? What did the police officer do? He drew his .357 Magnum and took a pot shot, point blank range, the chupacabras. And it was a split end bullet. You know, they can do a lot of nasty damage. Well, the chupa shot back from the recoil of this thing. It shot back against the car. There was blood on the floor, and it ran off at phenomenal speed. So nobody caught it or anything. The dog later had to be put down because it was so nervous. It never really recovered from the experience. And I understand blood samples were analyzed by forensic people in the Puerto Rico police. So that when this guy was talking about the experience, this police officer, the hairs on his hand, on his arm and hand stood up because he was reliving that experience very, very credibly. This is Jorge Martin, who is the principal researcher in Puerto Rico. We used to do many investigations together. And in 1995, 1996, a strange guy came to Puerto Rico called Cesar Remus. He introduced himself, actually previously in the United States, to Jorge Martin. Excuse me. Strange things happened. This guy admitted that he worked for the FBI. Strange things happened. Jorge's office was broken into. He'd had a new computer, but only the old computer with the interesting material on the hard drive was taken. Things like that. Excuse me. There were attempts to incriminate ufologists in Puerto Rico. This guy, Cesar Remus, came round trying to get the ufologists to handle a whole bunch of weapons that he had in his car boot. Okay? Then a guy called Chad Deatkin, some of you may know of him if you're interested in the crop circle. He's a Canadian, very good researcher. He came out in 1996 to Puerto Rico, did a lot of investigations. And he tried to get home with some samples, which he put in his suitcase, samples of hair from a chupacabras and blood samples and so forth, I think, other samples, soil. And he'd actually changed rooms in his hotel. And one night he heard a commotion coming from what would have been his room, people cursing. They were federal agents looking for his luggage. Luckily, they didn't succeed. The next morning, he took off for mainland USA. Puerto Rico, I'm sure you know, is a United States Commonwealth. And before he flew back to the mainland USA, prior to going back to Canada, the aircraft stopped at the end of the runway, the airliner that he was about to fly back on, and federal agents came aboard, or at least underneath in the hold, and searched around. And sure enough, when Chad got back to Canada, somebody had been searching for these materials, but they didn't get them because I think he'd sewn them in the lining of his sponge bag or something, so they didn't get them. This guy, Cesar Remus, was actually appointed as sort of state section director to MUFON by Walt Andrus, which I find unbelievable, but Jorge tried to explain how this guy's trying to incriminate us. He's causing dissension among the various groups, typical sort of counterintelligence maneuvers, and he was, and of course Jorge resigned. He didn't want to work with this guy. So I think that's of profound significance. El Yunque, a hot spot of UFO activity, mountain, beautiful rainforest, a lot of activity there. And I spent a lot of time there. I've never seen any, the only flying objects I've seen are mosquitoes, and believe me, they do one hell of a lot of damage. But I've interviewed a lot of people from all walks of life, including government workers, people, you know, in good positions in government, who, thanks to Jorge Martin, who helped me a lot in this research effort initially. a lot of people, undersea objects off the coast of Puerto Rico, many, and I'm convinced there's an alien base there and has been for some time, off the coast, maybe under the entire island, I don't know. But many people have seen strange things. This was seen by a security officer in northeast Puerto Rico coming home in the small hours. A weird craft with an apparent alien in control, followed later by a similar looking but apparently more primitive craft, which this guy, Hernandez, the witness, thinks is or was American, and he and several other people in Puerto Rico are convinced the Americans are trying to duplicate some of these craft. There's some type of liaison going there in Puerto Rico. Now, some of you might think this is a load of bull. In fact, it's some poor cow that was beamed aboard a craft near El Yunque in the presence of a security guard whom I interviewed together with Jorge Martin. And interestingly, it got up, it was struggling in this beam of light. As it got towards the craft, it became absolutely immobile. And later on, a van came by, or rather, as this security guard was watching, a van came up, and apparently federal agents came out and told the guy to stay where he was for 15 minutes. And he said, what the hell's going on? They said, never mind what's going on. We've got to do what we've got to do. Just stay here for 15 minutes. He did so. After 15 minutes, he headed down the road, and later he found the mutilated cow beside the road. He was a very frightened witness. He asked what I would advise for protection. So this is not a person who's making up a story. And interestingly, that was 1997. In 1996, as reported in the MUFON Journal, 12 Hispanic forestry workers encountered a UFO, and they witnessed it as a deer was actually taken up, an elk, in the St. Helens Mountain region of Washington State. So it's not unique to Puerto Rico. And again, the cow became immobile at a certain point. Very interesting correlation there.
Was that an actual photo, or?
No, it's digital manipulation done on somebody's laptop, I expect.
I wanted to make a comment about Puerto Rico and the underwater bases.
Yep.
I was told by somebody a few years back who had worked with Jacques Cousteau, they were doing diving in the area.
With Cousteau.
Right.
Yeah.
And they found an underwater base. Tell me about it.
An actual base?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah. This was about that.
I mean, you don't mean just something peculiar. I mean, a base? What do they see?
Yeah.
Little guys running around on craft or what?
It was an actual base. It had lights and everything.
Really? Could it have been a US Navy base? I mean, that's another thing. You know, Richard Sword has done a lot of good work on that. You know, it may have been something like that, do you think?
I'm suspicious because right before that happened,
Yeah.
I had somebody who thought I knew something.
Yeah.
That was connected with the CIA, and they come up to me and didn't have something that's going around Puerto Rico like I thought I did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I should have played along, but I didn't. And I said, well, tell me about it. And the guy
Okay.
turned around and walked the other way.
Okay.
That could be.
Right, well, finally, I'm moving on. In the last chapter of the book of Revelations here, I deal principally with the information given to me via Pentagon source, whom I mentioned. This was a general who served in the United States Air Staff and the Joint Staff at the Pentagon in the 1980s, and he in turn gave information. He gave this information to a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who's currently a respected journalist in Washington, who gave me this information over a period of several years and allowed me very graciously to publish this information. And of course some of it's disinformation, I'm quite sure about that, but I think basically the information holds good. Now then, I learnt that there are a number of alien bases around the world. Aliens have been coming here for a very long time. Some of the bases, or at least they said just the bases, were established following World War II. I think some of them, as we discussed earlier, may have been here for thousands of years. Who knows? Bases were in Australia, the Caribbean, and I'm sure that's Puerto Rico. The Pacific Ocean, there were 2 large bases in the Pacific Ocean, maybe in the Marianas Trench. You remember Enrique Castillo Rincon trip to the Marianas Trench. The former Soviet Union, and of course the United States, where there were several bases. And I learnt that one of the bases was in Alaska. Now, Alaska is, I think I'm right in saying it's about 1/6 the size of the United States. Am I right? It's enormous. There are hundreds of glaciers there. It's remote, a lot of it. Ideal place for an alien base. Also, supposedly, some 15 miles south of Greenbank National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Again, this was involved in the SETI program, and still is, ironically. We're not saying the location of these bases is true. It might be a load of bull, quite frankly. Certainly, 2 investigators went to this area and were unable to come up with any sort of, people saying they'd seen flying saucers or anything in the vicinity, 15 miles south of here. So, who knows? I was told that Manzano, within the Manzano Mountains, the Manzano nuclear weapons storage area, or nearby, there was an alien base. And it's interesting that many years ago, I was taken to the perimeter of this area by Colonel Ernest Edwards, who was in charge of security at the nuclear weapons storage area, I believe, and he seemed very convinced that very unusual things had been going on at that base there. Ridiculously, it seems the United States Army was, to a certain extent, guarding some of certainly the continental bases in the United States. It sounds mad, but remember that story from Fort Hood in 1947. The bases are vacated periodically, typically every 6 months, and then they come back. The officials, those few officials, very few people in the intelligence community have knowledge. It is the most sensitive subject within the intelligence community. I was told that around 100 people in OSI, that's the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, have knowledge in varying degrees of the alien presence. Interestingly, when I was invited to the Pentagon in May of 1998 by Major General Kenneth Israel at the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, one of the sort of hints he dropped to me was that this, he said, I don't see this as a national security issue, I see it as a policing issue. I think he said you'll find that the work is done in OSI. So that's interesting in itself, I think. What was of great concern was that the presence of the craft in the oceans, particularly in the Pacific Oceans, in an area of the Pacific Oceans, was contributing to a warming of the waters, which gave rise to considerable concern among those few in the intelligence community and scientific intelligence community who deal with this subject. They were also concerned that, as it was explained to me, the aliens were messing around with tectonic plates, which is also intriguing. I don't know, but what I learned was that there's certainly 2 factions. They said that, there are other guys coming here. Some of them are not friendly. Some of them are after this planet, was the way it was described to me. Others are obviously perhaps more friendly.
Have you ever discussed like a pole shift event or an Atlantis continent?
No, I never heard anything like that. This guy who was exposed to this information, or at least the guy, the original, the Pentagon general, at one stage allegedly was introduced to one of these aliens in a vicinity near Pine Gap in Australia. It's interestingly that some remote viewers, you know, there was a highly classified, most of the armed services had highly classified remote viewing programs. One of the remote viewers located an alien, was asked to look for alien bases, and located a base in Mount Zeal, which is about 80 miles west of Pine Gap. So who knows? I don't know. We must bear in mind disinformation. The craft use a form of electromagnetic propulsion taking advantage of the Earth's magnetic field. They are capable of faster than light travel. They have been sharing some of their technology with us. Now remember, this all goes back to the late 1980s. This information is way out of date already. As it was put to me, you know, we'll have to rewrite our physics textbooks. Plasma physics apparently was the key. We have learnt a lot about new plasma technologies. Their physics of light apparently is umpteen years ahead of ours. Aliens are capable of dealing mentally with any intruders. Some of the few military personnel who had met the aliens simply could not cope with it psychologically, and at least one of them was hospitalized at Walter Reed. So, time has just run out. I hope there's time for questions, but here's just a thing. They are capable of boring using their craft to create a sort of field which they can bore to astonishing depths, and presumably are able to cope with the intense heat. How deep they go precisely, I don't know. But in the case of Rubens Villela, he was told that they could bore to, you know, like something like 250 kilometers beneath the Earth's surface. And it's our Earth. Apparently, it's given rise to interest around the galaxy. They've been coming here, maybe some of them for millions of years. In my opinion, this is not what I learned, it's just my opinion, never mind Pentagon or whoever. There are many species. I wouldn't care to put a figure on it. We are a hybridized race. Human beings were developed from primitive humans on this planet. There's been colonization elsewhere. Colonization is going on throughout the universe. Maybe other races, some of them come from a dying planet. They're interested in colonizing Earth. Who knows? And I think finally, as I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, you know, whatever threat is posed by some of these beings, or I should just add that the general did not have a need to know about abductions, other than that they happened. He said you'll have to ask someone else about that because the information is compartmentalized. But the general was particularly disturbed that children were being abducted. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, whatever threats are posed by beings from elsewhere, we do have allies out there, and we have a great deal more to fear from our own people on planet Earth. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.